No one wakes up expecting that to be the day they disappear from their own life. For her, the morning began like so many others. The alarm went off at the usual time. The room was silent. Light entered through the window with the same softness as always. She got up without haste, prepared coffee, took a few sips in silence, and stood still for a few seconds, staring at nothing, as if she were saying goodbye to something no one else could see. There was no fight. There was no argument. There were no visible tears. She chose an ordinary outfit. Nothing flashy. Nothing that indicated an escape. She took her documents, her phone, her keys, checked everything twice, opened the door and left. To anyone who saw her at that moment, she was just someone else following her routine, just another anonymous face crossing the street, just another ordinary life in motion. What no one knew was that at that moment, something inside her had already been broken. The hours passed, the day progressed, the sun set, and she didn't return. At first, no one panicked. Maybe she was late. Maybe her phone had died. Maybe she had decided to stay out for the night. But when the night grew too deep and the silence began to weigh, concern took shape. Messages went unanswered. Calls went straight to voicemail. Restlessness grew by the minute. When they entered her room, nothing seemed wrong. The bed was made. The clothes in the closet organized. There were no suitcases missing, no note, no explanation. No sign of a struggle. No sign of haste. It was as if she had simply evaporated. The police were called early that morning. The term missing began to be used officially, and with it, the fears no one wanted to name arose. Because when someone disappears without leaving a trace, the mind creates images the heart cannot bear to sustain for long. Posters would be printed. Searches would be initiated. Theories would begin to emerge. But in that first moment, all that existed was a simple and terrifying question. Where is she? What no one imagined was that she knew exactly where she was, and above all, why she didn't want to be found. The disappearance ceased to be just an absence and began to occupy every space. In the very first hours, the police began standard procedures. Objective questions, quick notes, a watchful eye on every detail that at that moment seemed too insignificant to explain something so big. Friends were called, colleagues interrogated, neighbors questioned repeatedly. Every person who crossed her path began to be analyzed, like a possible piece of a puzzle that no one could assemble. The posters appeared quickly. Her photo, printed on plain paper, began to show up on poles, walls, markets, bus stops. A smile frozen in time, accompanied by a silent request. Have you seen this woman? Local programs displayed her image. Social networks shared her face hundreds of times. The city began to talk. Theories emerged almost instantly. Some were whispered, others said out loud. Kidnapping, crime of passion, something that got out of control. Each hypothesis was heavier than the last, and all seemed equally plausible to those observing from the outside. The family alternated between hope and despair. With every unknown call, their hearts raced. With every new lead, an expectation was born, and died too fast. Sleeping became difficult. Eating lost its meaning. Time began to be measured in news, not hours. But there was something that bothered the most attentive investigators. There were no signs of violence. No camera had recorded a pursuit. No witness reported screams, running, or cries for help. The path she had taken that morning seemed too peaceful for someone in danger. Everything indicated that she left because she wanted to. This possibility, however, was the hardest to accept, because admitting that someone chose to disappear raised uncomfortable questions no one wanted to ask out loud. Why would someone do that? What would lead a person to abandon everything without warning? And above all, what was happening in her life before she vanished? While the searches advanced without answers, a truth began to form slowly, almost invisible. Perhaps the biggest mistake of all was looking for signs of a crime, when the real conflict never happened on the outside. The first months were marked by expectation. Every day without an answer still carried the hope that everything would be resolved soon. The family believed that, at any moment, someone would call saying she had been found. A hospital, a police station, anywhere that would end the uncertainty. But time did not bring answers. It brought silence. The searches diminished. The calls became rare. The case, once treated as urgent, began to lose space among other disappearances, other crimes, other priorities. Her name began to be mentioned less frequently. The image on the posters faded with the sun and rain, until it disappeared completely. Officially, the case was not closed. But in practice, it had been set aside. For those who stayed, the pain changed shape. It was no longer the initial shock nor the constant panic. It was something heavier, deeper, an absence that became permanent, an invisible presence everywhere. Important dates passed without her. Birthdays, holidays, family gatherings. There was always an empty chair. Someone always avoided looking at that space for too long. Some began to accept the idea that she might be dead. Others clung to the possibility that she was alive somewhere far away. But no one could truly move on, because there was no end, no body, no goodbye, no explanation. Absence without answers is different from loss. It doesn't allow for complete mourning. It keeps the wound open. Meanwhile, far away, she lived a completely different reality. Not in comfort, not in absolute tranquility, but in silence. A chosen silence. A silence that, for her, was the only way to continue existing without losing herself completely. She followed everything from a distance. She knew about the searches. She knew about the speculations. She knew about the pain she caused, and that weighed more than any public judgment could weigh. But there was something no one saw. Before disappearing, she was already disappearing bit by bit. Not from the map, but from herself. And understanding this required going back in time, to a place where no one suspected something was wrong. Long before anyone noticed her physical absence, she had already been disappearing in another way. It wasn't something obvious. There were no cries for help, no blatant signs that something was wrong. On the contrary, to those observing from the outside, her life seemed normal. It functioned. It moved forward. It met expectations. But inside, something was slowly undoing itself. She learned early not to bother, not to create conflict, to smile when she needed to, even when she didn't feel like it. She learned to be strong without ever choosing it. Strong because there was no other option. People said she was reserved, quiet, too mature for her age. What no one realized was that this maturity was, in fact, a form of survival, a silent way to endure more than she should. Over time, invisible weights came, relationships that suffocated, expectations that weren't hers, a daily routine that required versions of herself she could no longer sustain. She tried to fit in, but each attempt pulled her a bit further from who she really was. There were nights when she wondered when it was that she stopped recognizing herself, when her own voice began to sound distant, when exhaustion stopped being physical and became existential. She thought about speaking up. She thought about asking for help. She thought about explaining that she was at her limit. But she always stopped at the same point: how to explain something even she couldn't name. So she did what she knew best. She fell silent. She continued going to the right places, keeping schedules, responding to messages with short phrases. Everything seemed in order. But each day required a greater effort to maintain that appearance, until the moment came when continuing seemed harder than disappearing. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It wasn't a desperate escape from one bad night. It was something built in silence, over years. A choice born from the deep exhaustion of existing for others and never for herself. She didn't want to die. She didn't want to be found either. She wanted to stop. Stop being who they expected. Stop sustaining a life she no longer recognized. Stop feeling trapped in a story written by others. And it was at that point, when the idea of continuing already hurt more than the idea of vanishing, that she began to plan the disappearance. But what no one imagines is that disappearing also has a price. The day she disappeared had nothing extraordinary about it. No large suitcase. No dramatic goodbye. No explanatory note left behind. Precisely because of this, no one suspected a thing. She left just like any other day. Her clothes were ordinary. Her face, neutral. Her pace, steady enough not to raise suspicion. Inside, however, every movement carried a decision that had been maturing for a long time. She knew exactly what she was doing. Not because she had all the answers, but because she could no longer bear the questions that life asked her every day. Questions about who she should be, where she should be, what she should endure. Questions that never considered what she wanted. Crossing the door, she didn't feel immediate relief. She felt fear, a deep, silent, almost paralyzing fear. Because disappearing isn't just leaving, it's breaking. It's accepting that from that moment on, everything would change. She turned off her phone before anyone could call. Not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. She knew that if she heard a familiar voice, she might give up. And giving up would mean returning to a place where she no longer existed as a person. Every step was an internal conflict. Part of her screamed to go back. Another part begged to move forward. She chose to move. She didn't have a definitive destination. She just had a starting point. Far enough not to be found, close enough to still feel alive. She chose places where no one knew her, where her name meant nothing, where her past didn't precede her. In the early days, she lived in a state of constant alert. She looked back frequently, observed faces. Any similarity felt like a threat. She slept little, thought too much. Freedom came mixed with guilt, fear, and a strange sense of doing something forbidden, even without committing any crime. Meanwhile, on the other side, the silence began to scream. Messages unanswered, calls ignored, an absence that made no sense. People thought of a delay, confusion, something temporary. But when the days passed and she didn't return, the tone changed. Concern turned into panic. Panic turned into searches. The disappearance became news. She learned about it later. At that moment, she only knew one thing: she was out of her old life. But she still didn't know if she could build another. Because disappearing doesn't erase who you were. It only creates space to discover who you can be. And this process is harder than it looks. In the first few months, the feeling was confusing. She was free, but she didn't feel light. There were no more direct demands, external expectations, or roles to fulfill. Still, the absence of all that didn't bring immediate peace. It brought silence, and silence, when not chosen with preparation, can be deafening. She needed to learn basic things again, presenting herself without explaining too much, telling her story in reduced versions, avoiding questions about the past. Every new conversation required constant attention not to slip on details that might betray her. She got temporary jobs, places where no one asked much, where she could exist without being observed in depth. She didn't seek prominence. She sought anonymity, the type of invisibility that allows one to breathe without being judged. At night, loneliness hit harder. There was no one to tell how the day went. There were no messages waiting for a response. There were no shared memories in that new space. She discovered that disappearing doesn't eliminate bonds, and it only transforms them into absence. She missed small things. Familiar voices, known laughter. Even old conflicts appeared in her memory with unexpected nostalgia. Not because they were good, but because they were familiar. And the unknown, as liberating as it may be, is exhausting. There were moments when she almost turned back. Moments when she held the switched-off phone for long minutes, imagining the impact of reappearing. She thought of the questions, the looks, the demands. She thought of the weight of explaining something that didn't have simple words. And then she remembered the reason why she left. She remembered how she was fading away, how she smiled without feeling it, how she survived but didn't live. These memories worked like an anchor, painful, but firm. Over time, something began to change. Loneliness stopped being just a void and became a space. Space to think, to feel without guilt, to make mistakes without an audience, to discover forgotten tastes and boundaries never respected. She started writing, not to publish, not to send to anyone. She wrote to hear herself, to organize thoughts that had never been said out loud. Every word on paper seemed to return a piece of herself that had been left behind. Freedom didn't arrive all at once. It was built in small daily choices. And even so, a question insisted on returning, especially on the quietest nights. How long could she sustain that disappearance without disappearing from herself? Time did something she didn't expect. It slowed down. Without the constant pressure to meet others' expectations, the days took on another rhythm. They were no longer filled with urgencies that made no sense. There was space between the hours, and in that space, she began to rebuild herself. For the first time, no one told her who she should be. This was liberating and terrifying. Without labels, without ready-made stories, without old versions to sustain, she needed to answer a simple and profound question. Who am I when no one expects anything from me? At first, there was no answer. There were automatic habits, inherited thoughts, old fears. But gradually, small choices began to emerge. She chose where to go, what to eat, whom to talk to, when to be silent. Simple things, almost invisible, but they had never really been hers. She started studying something that always sparked curiosity, but before seemed impracticable. Not because anyone had forbidden it, but because there was never space to want something just for wanting it. Now there was. She met new people, different relationships. She didn't need to explain herself too much. She didn't need to prove her worth. She was seen for what she showed there, in the present, not for what she had been in the past. This brought a strange sense of lightness, as if she could exist without carrying an entire history on her back. But the past didn't disappear completely. There were days when memories arose without warning, a specific smell, an old song, a place similar to another. In those hours, guilt tried to return, not for having gone away, but for having chosen herself. She wondered if it was selfishness, if it was cowardice, if she had the right to have vanished that way. And then she remembered. No one had asked if she was okay before she disappeared. No one had noticed she was already vanishing inside. This realization didn't bring anger. It brought clarity. She understood that her disappearance was not a rejection of people, but a desperate attempt, not to disappear completely as an individual. It wasn't an attack. It was a rescue. Gradually, the identity being built stopped depending on the escape. She no longer lived just not to be found. She lived to exist completely. And for the first time since she vanished, a thought began to emerge with real force. Maybe one day, she could tell the truth, not to justify herself, but to close a cycle. Because disappearing saved her, but remaining invisible forever. Maybe that wasn't the final destiny. The idea of telling the truth seemed simple, until it wasn't. Just imagining the moment someone from the past would hear her story made her body react. Her heart raced, her breathing shortened. It wasn't just fear of judgment, it was fear of losing everything she had rebuilt. Because disappearing had been painful, but reappearing could be even more so. She had created a life based on conscious choices, necessary silence, and clear limits. Telling the truth meant opening doors she had closed to survive. It meant allowing old interpretations to exist again, for questions to arise, for expectations to reappear, and above all, it meant running the risk of being pulled back into old versions of herself. For years she believed the greatest danger was being physically found, but now she understood. The real risk was being emotionally recognized, being seen as before, being reduced to the person she had been before the disappearance. She wondered if people would be able to listen, without trying to correct, without trying to explain, without saying what she should have done differently, because her choice was never comfortable. It was necessary. At some moments she thought about writing a letter, not to send, but to organize her thoughts. The words came out with difficulty. There were no clear villains, no heroes, just an exhausted woman trying to stay alive without losing herself completely. She didn't flee for lack of love. She fled for lack of space. This sentence appeared on paper as an incontestable truth. Even so, the doubt persisted. Was the world ready to hear something like that? Or did it prefer simple versions, defined culprits, easy-to-consume stories? There was also the fear of hurting those who stayed, not because she believed she was responsible for others' pain, but because she understood that her absence had left questions without answers. And unanswered questions usually hurt more than difficult truths. But there was something new growing inside her. Courage. Not impulsive courage, but that silent kind, born when someone finally respects themselves. She realized she didn't need to tell everything to everyone. She didn't need to expose herself completely. Telling the truth didn't mean losing control. It meant choosing how and when to speak. And this perception changed everything. Silence stopped being a hiding place and became a strategic choice. And with that, she began to prepare not to flee again, but to sustain her own story. Because now, unlike in the past, she wasn't disappearing to survive. She was thinking of reappearing, to close what remained open. She didn't wake up one day, decided to tell everything. The decision didn't come as an impulse, but as a silent accumulation. Small signs, interrupted conversations, memories that returned without asking permission. The truth began to weigh more than the silence. There was a specific moment, simple, almost invisible, that changed everything. She heard someone repeat a distorted version of her own story. Not her name, not her face, but a narrative too similar to be a coincidence. There, she understood that while she remained silent, other people would continue telling her story for her, and none of them would know what really happened. She chose to start slowly, not with a public revelation, not with dramatic details, just with an honest conversation, with someone who didn't want quick answers but real understanding. The words came out shaky, disorganized, imperfect, and that was okay, because the truth doesn't need to be beautiful to be true. She talked about the exhaustion no one noticed, about the weight of expectations that weren't hers, about the sensation of disappearing little by little even while physically present. She spoke of the loneliness that existed even before the vanishing. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't seek absolution. She just explained. And something unexpected happened. The world didn't collapse. Some people didn't understand. Others understood partially. Some moved away. Others drew closer for the first time. But no reaction was more frightening than the fear she had created in her own mind. The truth didn't resolve everything. It didn't erase old wounds or rebuild bonds automatically. But it brought something she hadn't felt in years: internal coherence. For the first time, what she felt inside didn't conflict with the image she presented to the world. There were tears, not of regret but of relief, the kind of crying that comes when someone stops defending themselves all the time. She understood then that telling the truth was not about convincing anyone. It was about stopping hiding from herself. It was about assuming that her choice, however difficult it had been, saved who she was inside. Some stories don't need applause. They just need to be recognized. And at that moment, hearing the respectful silence on the other side, she knew the disappearance had ended, not because everyone knew where she had been, but because she finally knew who she had become. Now only one last step remained. Not to run, not to explain too much, but to move forward with her own story in her hands. Years later, when everything seemed distant, she realized that the disappearance was never the end of the story. It was the intermission, a painful, silent, necessary space, a place where she could rebuild what had been broken before she even realized it. People still asked where she had been, some with curiosity, others with disguised judgment. But now, those questions no longer destabilized her. She no longer felt the obligation to explain every detail, to justify every choice, to apologize for having survived the way she could, because there are decisions that are not pretty. They are just urgent. She understood that disappearing was not cowardice. It was a limit. It was a silent cry from someone who had been ignored while speaking, invisible while present. And only when she vanished was she able to be heard by herself. The return didn't happen with announcements nor cinematic reunions. It happened in everyday life. in small choices, in more honest relationships, in a life built without the need for constant approval. She came back different, firmer, less available for that which consumed her. Some people never accepted her decision. They preferred the old version, more predictable, easier to control. Others understood too late, but that no longer defined who she was. What defined her was the peace she had found by stopping living to sustain others' expectations. She learned that no one disappears of their own free will without first having tried to stay in every possible way. That vanishing, often, is the last alternative of one who has already been ignored too much. And maybe that is the hardest part to accept. Not every disappearance is an escape. Some are survival. Today, when she looks back, she doesn't romanticize what she lived through. There was pain, guilt, loneliness, but there was also rebirth. A silent kind, without applause, without external validation. She didn't return to be understood by everyone. She returned so as not to lose herself again. And by telling her story, she didn't seek to justify the past, only to remind that no one completely knows the internal battle of one who decides to vanish. Sometimes those who disappear don't want to be found, they just want to stop hurting. And when they finally tell the reason, it's not to shock, it's to close. Because some stories just need a fair ending. And this one, she wrote with courage. Stories like this remind us that not every disappearance is an escape. Sometimes it's survival. Sometimes it's the only path to stay alive inside. Maybe you know someone who vanished. Or maybe, in silence, you've already wished to disappear for a while. Not always to leave the world, but to find yourself again. If this story touched you in some way, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. And if you believe that real, deep, and human stories need to continue being told, subscribe to the channel now. That way, you won't miss any content like this. Don't forget to like the video. It helps the algorithm take this story to more people who need to hear it. And in the comments, if you feel like it, write just one word. Restart. Sometimes that's all someone needs to read to keep going. See you in the next video.